faced generations of gendered violence as mechanisms of social control, we say it is, to be frank, patronizing to describe a desire for revenge as just being some sort of primal thing of the past that we should get rid of, that they should just merely turn this cheek. And so we're happy to pour acid in the eyes of people who do these kinds of attacks. Two broad arguments now openings of the government. First, I want to talk about the nature of this specific kind of gendered violence, how we can deconstruct that through this. And then secondly, I want to talk about how this is an act of self-defense by women as a class, and it's a thing we should be happy to stand for. Three pieces of framing before that, though. Firstly, recognize that in the context of the Iranian justice system, violence is already something that is heavily entrenched. So that doesn't change with this policy. But then secondly, recognize that retribution is also something that is massively entrenched within that justice system. But what we say is the women, before this started happening, women who were the victims of this attack were crucially denied that specific kind of justice when everybody else in the society could get that. Then thirdly, just in terms of broadly what we stand for, we say we're happy for this to continue, we're happy for it to happen a lot, we're happy for with the victims themselves to make the decision as to whether or not they do that. That's broadly what we stand for. I think it's quite simple. First argument then, what is the nature of this kind of gender violence? So recognize that violence against women is endemic, like obviously in lots of places, but specifically Iran in this context. And this is a specifically pernicious example of that. What is the nature of it? We say it's not just specifically an act of physical harm causing women pain, or even just an act of aiming to cause trauma. We'd say it's about denial of agency. It's about it being a mechanism of social control. It's about punishing women for the temerity to choose their own path. So we say that allowing this is crucial in returning agency to the women who this kind of thing has happened to. How does this happen? Three broad reasons. So firstly, we would say, should the victim want to do this, it can be a tremendous act of catharsis for them to harm their perpetrator. Given the trauma that that victim has undergone, we are happy to care far more about them getting the catharsis than we are about the harm that's happening to the person who did it, given they made the decision to do that in the first place. But then secondly, right, recognize the power of it essentially making men appear weak, essentially. This man, when this happens, is now at the mercy of the victim for her to decide what to do, like whether or not she wants to pour acids on his eyes or not. Crucially, that can also mean not choosing to do it, right? We think that can happen in a number of cases as well. That also fulfills that kind of same thing. But then thirdly, right, we'd say the symbology of this happening and of people being aware of it happening tends to deconstruct the fear surrounding this kind of attack, and the fear that specifically women should have of this kind of attack, right? Insofar as it's now used, in an incredibly different context, and in a context that's all about empowering women, right? That means women generally are less likely to be feared by the symbology of this kind of act as it happens. We think that's really important. What time I am, by the way? My timer went out. 3:30. I'll take a few wine now before I go on. No deal, okay. Second argument, the self-defense of women as a class. So the first thing we would say here is that we think this functions as a hugely effective deterrent to men performing this act, right? We think when men know that this can happen to them, they're that doing this is very extremely likely to lead to acid being poured on their own eyes. We think they're extremely unlikely to do it. Recognize that this is specifically effective in the context of Iran, right, where the state is incredibly powerful as compared to other countries in the region, right? It's very easy for the state to catch people when they're committing these crimes. The kind of tropes that people put in other Arabic countries, such as particular tribes or families, like hiding particular things, just are less common in Iran, right? Because the state has much more power there. But also recognize that, even if the idea of the pain of it isn't a deterrent, the idea of just how humiliating it will be to happen to you, that's a massive deterrent to stopping men from doing it. What we'd add to this, though, is a crucial principle, right? We'd say, since women are likely to be subject to this kind of violence and presents an imminent threat, I'll take you now.
Rape is endemic in society. Do you support the rape of prisoners?
No. It's up to you to explain why that's exactly analogous, but to be honest, if this motion requires me to top that, I don't want to win, so... continuing that principle, right? We think that, so this violence presents an imminent threat to women, both to that woman herself in the future, but also to other women, right? We'd say then, given that it presents an imminent threat, and given that typically we think it is legitimate for people who face legitimate acts of violence to perform violence on their attacker, we think this functions as an act of self-defense by women as a class, right? We think that's a thing that we should definitely allow them to do. But we also think, even if that woman specifically isn't necessarily going to be a victim in the future, we think it's also legitimate to act in this way to protect other women going forward, in the same way we think it's okay to intervene in situations and perform violence on somebody who threatens violence against another person. Sorry, what time am I at now again? 5:50. Finally then, on this, we'd say there is a, beyond the mere kind of deterrent effect, we'd say that as the kind of flip of the symbology thing in my last point, when the symbology, through the symbology of this, when this act loses its power as a thing that only like men do to women who misbehave, and now becomes a thing that the women and the state do to men due to men as well, right? We'd say it loses its power as an act that men would even want to perform in the first place, right? It loses the power that it previously had, right? That is another way in which it leads to less men being likely to do this in the future, and another reason why we say this is a legitimate act of self-defense and a thing that we're very, very happy to support. So, crucially then, the comparative, more principle than anything else, but the comparative in this debate is that we allow victims a sense of catharsis, a sense of deconstructing the awful gendered violence that happens to them, and we allow victims to use self-defense, and we allow women as a class to protect themselves in the context of these awful things happening. We are so happy to propose.
Sharia law is applied. We also regret the presence of a retribution for personal things in Sharia law. Two things in this speech. Firstly, why we cannot support this gross miscarriage of justice, and secondly, why the application of Sharia law in this case has proved to be a huge impediment for the progression of women's rights in Iran, for which this opening government claims all their benefits. Firstly, on justice. The first thing we would tell you is that in general, we think it is wrong for a victim to decide on the punishment of their perpetrator. And that is something that is a universal principle, one that we should also apply and consider in Sharia law. That is firstly because the victims are often too proximate. That is because often in these cases, the women are literally related, no thank you, to their perpetrator. There is a huge liability for abuse where you literally have feelings from which you cannot extricate and experiences from which you cannot view objectively. That is the exact reason why even in Iran, judges nor jurors cannot be related and are not related to the people they are trying, nor to the victims of those attacks. But secondly, we think it places a massively unfair burden on these most vulnerable women to tell them that it is now their responsibility to decide how that is done. We think that is unfair. Opening opposition doesn't just regret it in general, we regret retribution more generally. The second thing to say here, and we think this entrenches that, as I'll talk about in my second point. The second reason is we think it leads to hugely unequal enforcement where the culpability and harm are equal. In a lot of these cases, you have two men who have both committed the exact same crime, women who experience similar harms. Some women will decide to let their perpetrator get off scot-free. I'm going to prove to you later why that will be a huge proportion of those women, others won't. We think that is something a justice system that is fair and should not stand by. One, we in opening opposition don't support. What did opening government tell us? They told us this was self-defense for a woman individually and as a class. Firstly, individually, we would note in opening opposition that this would justify all forms of vigilantism, no thank you, equivalent to the crime. We want to hear from opening government whether they would support women, without any invigilation of the law or anyone else, throwing acid on the faces of their perpetrators. We think going into the future, using legal structures and legal avenues are incredibly important for the practical reasons I'm about to say. But secondly, we think the justification on the basis of protecting others is usually contingent on whether you actually do protect those others. I'm going to talk about that in my second point. So that is just to say, if opening government wants to justify a structure that allows people too proximate to the crime and to unevenly apply treatment of a law that should be objective, they need to justify why they would do that. They need to defend vigilantism.
Question.
Secondly, on the major issue in this debate, why the use of Sharia law is a huge backstep in women's rights in this case. The first thing to say here is we think on the outset, and I'm going to take a kind of timeline approach here, at the point at which someone is going to the police or being reported, we think you are drastically lowering the chances of conviction. The first thing to say there is police and jurors probably have sympathy with the motive of in an incredibly sexist society, or they have sympathy with the motive of the perpetrator and might dislike the victim. For instance, if a victim has committed adultery, that society is generally sympathetic towards the perpetrator in that instance. And knowing that you are empowering a victim who has committed, in their eyes, a crime of adultery, they are unlikely to do so in the first place. The second reason why you lower the chances of conviction, because judges and juries are less likely to hand the form of empowerment, is because there is very little clear message from the state what the acceptable form is. What we would prefer in opening opposition is, we don't care whether it is punishment that is corporal or not, we would prefer a standardised form of punishment applied by the state, and that would be preferable. That sends a clear message to everyone in that society of what is acceptable, and instead of suggesting that you are empowering those who have committed crimes. The second thing to say here is the vast majority of women are not going to take the option and not going to throw acid in the face of their perpetrator. If you look at the cross-section of types of women that have been the victims of these acid attacks, they're often being attacked by relatives because of the fact that they have wronged that relative. That means they come under a few forms of pressure. The first thing is immense family pressure from literally having to hurt your relative, particularly when you might feel some internal guilt. Secondly, there's things like economic reliances, when your family relies on that person having their sight to go and do their job. But thirdly, we think there is a narrative in Iranian society that victims, where possible, particularly female victims, should forgive their perpetrator. That is one a lot of these women buy into. And notice, panel, only a few women need to take this to the Tehran Daily for it to print that these women who have committed adultery and then hurting their husband because their husband has taken that out on them. What are the impacts of that? Firstly, women are hugely disempowered, opening government gets none of their benefits. Secondly, the perpetrators literally get off scot-free compared to what we would not support in the alternative. But thirdly, there's far less of a disincentive to do this if you know that you can pressure your partner into not punishing you. You cannot pressure the state. But for those that do, opening government tells us it's cathartic. We think these women broadly get shut out of their families, excluded from their communities, compared to where the state sends a clear message this is unacceptable by enforcing punishment. The penultimate thing to say here, and I'll take you in a minute, is this justifies other attacks. In Muslim states, in Iran in particular, the state and religion are intertwined. I'll explain that in a moment, but firstly, Michael.
Okay, so given that the actor that is allowing this to happen is the Iranian state, and the Iranian state controls what Islam as a religion means in Iran, why would all the vilification from the press that you talk about actually happen?
The Iranian state has decided that Islam is referring to women in this case. It's easier to shift accountability onto the woman who was the last point before the person had acid thrown in their eyes. So, in Muslim states, the state and religion are intertwined from the first caliph to the Grand Ayatollah in Iran. We think this gives just cause for this further justifies the initial acid attacks. For when a person has been wronged, you accept that someone has the right to go back on that wrong, to provide retribution. So, something like adultery, which is considered a crime, both legally and socially, is justified when people go back on it. That sees more women being attacked on the streets as opposed to a blanket policy. Instead of saying that the victim does not have the right to do that. Finally, this is a massive impediment to reform. This is an illusion of women's empowerment. And when the international bodies of human rights or other countries point out high rates of revenge attacks, high rates of sexual assault, the Iranian government gets to point to this as a facade of justice. We think that is wrong. When very few women are accessing actual justice, when women are being pressured by their families, when women are being told that their attacks don't matter and told they should suck it up. We on the opening opposition, we're the only people that could stand up for women in this debate. We'll send a strong message through state channels, so proud to oppose.
get justice, which was OO's main metric in terms of how they want to win this debate. We think that we can show you we get justice for these victims, we win the debate overall because we think that's the most important. We're also going to beat them on consequences though. First though, I just have to deal with the rape analogy because I'm afraid they're going to pin their case on it and I don't want to listen to that, right? Like, with all due respect, this is just a messed up analogy, right, for a couple of reasons. One, because rape is always gendered, no matter who's committing it, and the gender of the person they're committing. So if you have a man doing that to another man, it is still an act of gendered violence which plays into rape culture. That is not the case here. Secondly, the other person involved is put in a position of power, of explicit sexual power, which they then can't change that experience, which changes their opinion of other sexual actors in society, which means that allowing a rape to be committed, any rape of any person, no matter if they've done that, is unacceptable, and that is why it's not analogous. So, now that that's tanked, onto the other stuff, right? A couple of things of framing, right, in terms of how this actually works, responses to Sophie, right? So Sophie says, oh, like, as in, so the problem is, like, some men will be getting off scot-free, and women will be pressured to let them get off scot-free, and then other men will be acid attacked. Note, firstly, that we are not saying that the choice is between an acid attack and no punishment at all. That is absolutely untrue. The Iranian state holds its right and will refuse to give up its right to punish people who commit crimes, because a crime isn't just against a person, it's also against the state and the state's laws. So there will still be punishment. But moreover, all of their analysis about retribution and about vilification of women is true in the status quo, insofar as it will be true under this policy. Because any punishment of a man who acid attacks a woman because she is not properly Muslim in his eyes, or because she wrongs him in some way, if a police officer believes that he was justified in doing that, if a juror or a judge believes that he was justified in doing that, which, by the way, they generally aren't, and we think that it's like misinformed to claim that they are, because it is incredibly important, both in Islam and Iran, to not contravene the laws of non-violence and to not contravene the authority of the state to govern those laws. So first of all, we just reject their characterization of the police and the justice system of Iran. But even if that were true, the same would be true if the men were getting 40 lashes or a prison term or whatever in the status quo, right? Because they would say, if they were that, if they were that misogynist, and if they were that not accepting of a woman's right to get justice, then they would say that any contravention of that man's rights is unacceptable, so that was non-comparative, right? We think that when they say that all that stuff about retribution, they miss a couple of things. So first of all, we think that it's the Islamic, the justice system in Iran is fundamentally ruled by what are essentially Islamic councils, right? So that's why we think retribution doesn't happen, because if there are retributions towards these women, you're also going against not only the state of Iran, but the Islamic authorities. So we think that's incredibly unlikely, right? But on vigilantism, right? As in, this is happening in the context of the state's justice system, right? It is not an example of vigilantism. Allowing a victim to choose whether the perpetrator of their attack has acid puts in their eyes or gets 40 lashes or whatever their punishment might be is not an act of vigilantism. It's not like you send them out on the street and tell them to fight it out, right? It happens within a very, very controlled context, and it does not happen to people who haven't been tried and found guilty, right? But moreover, it's non-comparative because, as we said, there is always a punishment, right? We actually think the status quo is much more prone to vigilante attacks. For example, but let's say a woman is acid attacked, her brother, for example, or herself would be much more likely to want to do vigilante justice by attacking the perpetrator because they feel like they can't get justice, because 40 lashes or a prison term or whatever isn't enough, because this woman's life is fundamentally changed and fundamentally destroyed by this attack, and the justice that they get before this policy was introduced is not enough. So we actually think there's a huge incentive for vigilantism, on offside, that they haven't dealt with, and which they won't be able to deal with. So when you give power to the victims within the context of the justice system, it's a much better situation, and it's a lot less likely to encourage that, right? Actually, I'll take over.
Is a man more or less likely to throw acid on his daughter for, say, premarital sex if he knows that he can get away with it with impunity because she is his dependent?
But I just find it shockingly unlikely that man would get caught anyway if she's that dependent on him. Because what you're asking right now is, would a daughter report her father to police if if she knew he'd get acid attack. She probably wouldn't report him if she knew he'd go to prison or would get 40 lashes, because that would also dishonour him, right? So those cases are non-comparative. We are talking about the cases where a woman might be willing to see a man get 40 lashes or go to prison. In those cases, we think it is important to let the woman decide. So let's talk about choice and justice for women, right? Say it's wrong for women to be able to decide, because like that's a contravention of justice and you have to have the same punishment for every crime. That is nonsense, right? Not every murder is the same, not every act of sexual violence is the same, not every crime is the same. We assess the damage done to victims and sentence accordingly all the time based on the amount of pain and the amount of damage was done to their life. But because this is a fundamentally gendered crime, because this is a crime against the woman that it happened to, but also against all women, and because, crucially, this is a justice system that is dominated by men who can never understand that experience, the woman in this situation is the only person who can accurately assess the level of what happened to her, the amount of damage done to her, and therefore whether it is legitimate for the same thing to happen to her attacker. We think justice is much better on our side because that understanding happened. We are also happy to take a hit on a slightly uneven carriage of justice if we are able to systematically empower women in a way that they are disempowered, right? We think it is patronizing to say that it is just difficult for women to choose, so we shouldn't even let them try. We think they can try and choose. We think they can choose to say no or yes, right? We also think it's just non-comparative to say that a coerced choice is worse than no choice at all. They got no choice before this policy was introduced, so we think it's much better, right? They call it a facade of justice. We think that this is that until the justice system actually changes, we ask what victims are supposed to do to get that kind of justice. We think that it will change because of this, for all the reasons that Michael told you about deconstructing this as a symbol and deconstructing this as a way of of oppressing women, none of which were responded to by Sophie, right? We think that no punishment besides this for some women could ever fulfill and could ever get them justice for what was done to them. We think that they're the best people to choose whether that should happen. We are proud to propose.
For the majority of the victims who are asked to make this choice, it will not be empowering. It will be a further humiliation, a further abuse, and it will disempower them further. Sophie showed you in her speech why most won't feel able to do so. And crucially, in the process of being unable to do so, we think they face further extremely distressing moral choices. They face further isolation and complications surrounding their family. They face further coercion. So close opening government are right when they tell us the victim is the most important. So that's why we don't think a punishment which asks the victim to suffer again can be morally justifiable. 2 points in this speech. Firstly, why we think the effect on the person who is asked to make this decision is uncountenanceable. Secondly, why we think the effect on the international situation regarding punishment of this sort is also intolerable. Before that's a rebuttal to what we were given previously. Their response to Sophie's entire, very well analysed case about why it was more likely that people would feel unable to go, that there would be prosecutions, was to say it was not a reporting issue in response to our POI. Crucially, regrettably, this is an issue which is obviously going to be clear to everyone when the crime has been committed. So even people when it's in their family, and that is a family abuse case, will be known to the police, and these cases will come to the police. So those cases are in play in this debate, and we think the effects on those who are asked to do this against a member of their family who's committed a crime against them should be considered. Secondly, we agree we should prioritise victims. We just don't think an extraordinarily difficult decision of this kind is fair to them in this context. Secondly, in terms of a justice system which is fair in the way it allocates retribution, the only response they give is to say that the victims are the most important. Obviously, we agree the victims are the most important, but we have to remember that when there is a justice system which is unfair, which doesn't judge, which allows judgment by those who are proximate or unevenly applied. It's ultimately those who are most disempowered who suffer the most, because they have the least ability to apply those powers of coercion, the least ability to gain credibility or that benefit of the lottery of how it's applied when they're seen as more credible or they're seen as inherently more honest because of the ethnic group they come from or their gender. Thirdly, in terms of reduced disincentive, we show that people can be pressured into not doing this and would likely do so in the majority of cases in a way which meant this doesn't provide an incentive to people who are considering perpetrating this crime. Crucially, this coupled with a reduced chance of conviction. Why? Because those people, though they are potentially, when convicting someone, subject to being blinded with acid themselves, which means they're less likely to do so. We think that if they have some level of residual sympathy, which is not an unreasonable suggestion given the justice system in Iran is fundamentally misogynist, and also that these attacks are relatively common, suggesting whilst most sections of society probably don't tolerate it, some extremely conservative sections, such as might dominate the justice system, are likely to, people are likely to feel a high level of sympathy, it's less likely we get convictions. That means that there's a reduced disincentive. Crucially, we think there's also a reduced chance of a strong further punishment in those cases in the form of a prison sentence or other corporal punishment. Why? Because someone is seen as having risked it and won with the lottery, and therefore it will be unfair to place a higher punishment upon them, and therefore they're unlikely to be subject to higher punishment. Also, it's possible it will be interpreted as an act of forgiveness in a way which will entitle that person to reduced punishment. So we think we see a reduced disincentive in a way which means more of these crimes occur. Fourthly, we think more attacks also occur because you endorse the mindset. Crucially, this is not a point about vigilantism. This is the point about a conception of a justice system. When people conceive this as a justified and religious way to mete out justice to those they see as immoral, because the state has specifically endorsed it, it's more likely they perpetrate gendered violence in this manner against those who are close to them or they perceive to be immoral. So we think it is worse for victims and also provides a reduced disincentive against doing so, whilst also undermining the very basis of the justice system. So firstly, why we think the effect on those who are put through this emotional violence in the form of being asked to make this decision is so terrible. So you have to bear in mind the situation these people find themselves in is extraordinarily vulnerable. They know that because they've been condemned as immoral, they will struggle either to get married or to find work, and also they find themselves in the context of a justice system which is extraordinarily misogynist and somewhat prejudiced against them. In this, two things are likely to enhance their suffering. I'll take you in just a minute. Firstly, the family, from which they need both emotional support, but also they need financial support because their ability to work or their ability to get married has been reduced by this act of violence, is likely to be split with them at the point where most of these crimes are specifically committed by members of their family. At the point where this is a specifically family-based form of intimate violence, opening a government's refusal to engage with the vast majority of how these crimes are unfortunately committed is a major flaw in their case, which leaves them unable to engage with the majority of victims, the emotional trauma they face when they're further divided from their family. But secondly, we think at the point where you're being asked to make this enormous moral decision and pressed with a dilemma you might regret or vacillate about for the rest of your life and you will find incredibly difficult in any circumstance, that is an unacceptable form of burden on people who've already suffered too much, who are already undergoing trauma. Go for it.
Okay, you claim that this legitimizes the use of these attacks against women. Michael explained to you why these attacks are currently used to socially control only women, and men consider themselves safe from them and above them, and how this deconstructs that. Would you care to engage?
The problem is that men consider themselves safe from punishment and morally justified. Specifically, this motion enhances both, because it decreases the chance they'll face proper punishment, as demonstrated in my rebuttal, and also as demonstrated in Sophie's speech, it endorses this vision of justice to some extent, and therefore makes it more likely the thought culture in which these crimes continue is perpetuated. So you are placing someone with an extraordinary moral dilemma which they're not in a situation to face. But moreover, it defines someone even more. They will go through the rest of their life being asked whether they chose to blind the person who put this out against them. Everyone will judge them once again when they've already been judged for immorality and they've already had their life ruined because someone alleges they are morally wrong merely for exerting their own agency. It places more stigma on them, it defines them more by the crime which has been committed against them and stops their ability to have their own identity. Secondly, in terms of internationality, look, there are many modernized and highly progressive forms of Islamic law. There are people across the Islamic world who are fighting for that form of Islamic jurisprudence. The problem is, at the point where Iran is able to justify, therefore, by claiming it is not regressive, that it doesn't fundamentally commit violence against women in the legal system by saying, oh look, we give women this right to retribution, it endorses the more regressive views against the people who are fighting for an inclusive and tolerant vision of Islam. But moreover, it builds up prejudice against Islamic jurisprudence in the West and forms part of the wave of Islamophobia when people decide punishments of this sort. Worse for victims, worse for Islamic law generally. Very proud to oppose.
We thank the Deputy Prime Minister very much and indeed the entire first half. In order to open the second half of the debate, we call upon the Member of Government. Hear, hear.
will forgo that line of argumentation. Your catharsis is not worth another woman suffering at the hands of a violent man. We say you do not have the legitimacy to use her as a shield. Opening Keynes said the victim is the most important thing in this debate. We disagree. We think the potential victims who could be harmed in the future are the most important thing in this debate. Why do we think that? One, we think the status quo of law generally thinks that. We think the state is set up to protect the people who have not yet been harmed, and the state recognizes that at the point at which it itself, in the name of those other citizens, sues the perpetrator and doesn't allow the victim themselves to do that. Secondly, by OG's own analysis, no amount of retribution can ever return what was taken from a woman who was attacked and harmed. That means that the net damage to a woman harmed is always and inherently greater than the feeling of retribution that she can gain by regaining her sense of autonomy through harming her attacker. Two things for closing opposition in this debate. One, on an individual level, why this is going to backfire and cause more women to be harmed, and two, on undercutting the principles of Khomeini Sharia law, why we think on a state level this is going to massively backfire and harm substantially more people. 2 points of extraneous rebuttal before that. One, OG tried to argue for self-defense. OG do not understand what self-defense means. Self-defense, in and of itself, is a protective system. It means by doing it, I prevent the harm from happening. At the point at which the harm has already happened, it inherently cannot be self-defense. Now they say, look, this is group self-defense. By allowing this, we allow women as a group to defend themselves. I'll engage with that directly in the analysis that I bring you on why this is unhelpful for the group. Secondly, they say this bestows agency through the mere act. Look, we're happy to have these women be the ones who lock the prison door and throw away the key to the perpetrators. Note that none of their analysis on this point explains why it needs to be done through violence, only why it needs to be done through an act of empowerment. Because taking away someone's life by locking them up in prison forever takes that act, gets exactly what they want without the violence. Why is that violence so bad? Let's get to the first step on the message backfiring individual. We think the way this plays out is that you see some men walking down the street with blisters all over their face. We think this is a visceral message. This is the type of thing unlikely to go ignored. What does that mean? OO already tell you that there is... No. Basically, we say the message given to individuals is very clear that based on Sharia law, it is justified to use massive acts of violence in order to protect the things that are important to Sharia law. Note, please, this is the exact rationale used by men who perpetrate these attacks, who say because she violated Sharia law in order to, when she slept with a man before marriage, it is legitimate to use massive violence against her. What do we think that means? We think at the point at which the state is legitimizing this notion, these people are then caught between two contradictory messages to an extent. On the one hand, the state is supporting the notion that says the use of violence via Sharia law is legitimate, and on the other hand, they're saying we will punish you if you do so because it is problematic. How do we think that gets resolved? Note that we think these people are in and of themselves as potential perpetrators are specifically the type of people who buy into the most extremist interpretation of Sharia law. That is why they're willing to do these things. We think then, at the point at which the state says you have the option of supporting the more extremist views of Sharia law or the way the state moderates and interprets those laws, these specific individuals are more likely to interpret them in the more extremist views. That means of the batch of potential people who can do these kinds of acts, you are widening the number of people who are likely to commit these kinds of acts. Now, they tell us, but look, this is so horrendous, it will create deterrence. People simply won't stop doing it. 3 answers to that. A, note that no explanation was actually ever given to you as to why this is so much more deterring than life in prison. Sure, we think acid in your face is massively deterrent. We also think having all of your freedom taken away from you in perpetuity is quite a deterrent thing. B, note there is a specific Shahid mentality of the people who ascribe to the more extremist views of Shiite laws, which say, I will take upon myself the physical pain of following Sharia law. We think that mentality for these specific people is likely to continue in this instance. COO already tell you that, wait, I can't read my own hand. OO already tell you that you feel like you're less likely to be caught. We add upon that within the things that create deterrence, your likelihood of being caught is what most massively affects the deterrence. So if it is true that you are less likely to be caught, or even if it's not true and you still feel like you're generally as unlikely to be caught for this as you are in Iran anyway as a man committing a gendered crime, we still think deterrence does not rise substantially based on this.
Okay, so your opening said victims can never participate in retributive justice because that messes up the justice system. You say you're happy for victims to lock the door and throw away the key. But even if that wasn't a massive knife, the agency is in the choice.
It's called an even if. Even if instead. Secondly, on undercutting the principles of Khomeini Sharia law. Though this is massively engaging, this engages with the premise that OG start with that says violence and retribution are entrenched within these societies, and it engages what CG give you on not implementing non-Western values. We tell you there is a different counterfact. We tell you Khomeini started a situation in which Sharia law is interpreted in a more moderate way. He did this knowing that he needs to balance to some extent between the world as it stands and between the godly law written in the Quran. This is exactly exemplified by notions of an eye for an eye, where Khomeini would say you cannot take that kind of justice because it's too much of an extreme view of Sharia law. Now this is massively impactful within Muslim society. How do you see this? No, far fewer extremists within Shiite communities than within Sunni communities, for example. We say this has huge impact. Now, Khomeini was recently replaced as the Ayatollah. This means that there is a battle for the rhetoric and the way in which the state progresses now. By supporting this law, we say the new Ayatollah is pulling Shiite law, Sharia law, back towards the direction of extremism. We say that pull is exactly what gets more hands cut off. It's exactly what gets more massive board in more women's face. It's exactly what gets the massive impact that no other team has brought you. So proud to report.
We thank the member of opposition very much, and it's time for the whips, and we start with the government one. Here.
Israeli intelligence officer, all that time listening to Iran, is finally paying off. What happened has been very, very clear in this debate is that a lot of these teams don't know what's happening in Iran. A lot of these teams don't understand how Sharia law is translating to Iran. A lot of the characterizations of what we see in Sharia law in Iran are apparently taken from Saudi Arabia. That's not how Iran interprets Sharia law. And this is what Eitan comes here and tells you and just isn't responded to, because I guess it wasn't that important. So what I'm going to do is do three things. I'm going to talk about how currently the justice system is set up in Iran, how this impacts that justice system, how it moves it away from the more moderate system, which Khomeini, with the middle ground, has put in, how this, I'm going to afterwards talk about women and the question of choice in this debate, and why this weird attempt to say this is a knife is just a bit petty, and finally, I'm going to talk about how we create less harm overall. So let's talk about the justice system. Because what closing governments say is, look, opening OO isn't right? We can't just have this standardized point. You can't impose your values on Iran, no thanks. You can't just impose your values on Iran. You can't just have these standardized notions of equality and everything. An eye for an eye is this incredibly important part of Sharia law. It's also an incredibly important part of Jewish law. But the thing is, we don't actually think that you need to take an eye out for an eye, right? And neither does Khomeini, because Khomeini, right, when Khomeini created his interpretation of Sharia law, he had this idea of a middle ground. It said, the Messiah has not yet come. This means that we cannot yet interpret fully the word of God. We must create a middle ground in which we take the law, but still try and apply it to the mundane system of things. This created a far less extreme version of Islam, right, which is very much prevalent inside the Shiite system, and this is the kind of system which doesn't go in for the massive amount of retribution, that doesn't cut people's hands off for being thieves. They want to take a system which is against this, right? They want to take this system and subvert it, pushing it towards a far more regressive form of system. Now, OO touch upon this, how this might happen. We provided far better explanation as to why this is a central tenet of the current Iranian government, and why this will now change according to this. And this is what's really important, because when you introduce this kind of method into Iranian law, as they point out, clerics are interpreting this kind of law. This is exactly what happens. Clerics see this as a precedent. When the Ayatollah changes the kind of law, this is like changing the constitution. This means that clerics, therefore, down in the different states, then take this as a precedent to retranslate Sharia law, not just in this case, but in other cases of retribution, in other cases of justice as well. This is what creates a retributive system of justice inside Iran. This is what pushes us away from the moderate form of Iran that Khomeini has created, and I never thought I would say that in my life. So this, at the end of the day, is the biggest thing in this debate. This is the changing of the very fabric of what happens to an Iran. No thanks. Nobody has been responded to this. No one has been in direct engagement, and now I will take closure.
Opening opposition says that they oppose all forms of retribution. You now say that you prefer a middle ground espoused by Rouhani. In what way is this not your second knife of this?
Because that's not what I just said, right? A middle ground Right, let's move on to the other knife of the tournament, right? Because here they say, you said that you would let women lock the door, but they said, no thank you, that the victims shouldn't have any place in the system. A couple of things, Liz. A, notice that a lot of the things that have come up in the opening house have been met specific on the issue of choice that OG decided to put in, whether or not women have the choice or not. These are not inherently issues of this debate. But the other thing that is far more important to note is that what OO tell you is that you cannot have the victim involved because it is unequal enforcement, right? Because if the victim chooses whether or not to throw acid in the face in one case and someone else doesn't, this is something which a justice system can't have. They don't say, however, that if we're going to do this no matter what, we're going to send everybody to jail. It doesn't matter who locks the door, right? That is the act of empowerment that we are giving them. This is why you still have the standardized system, and they're still able to have the victim come in and play in this system. And this is why we think that even if choices such as massive issues that you put out, you have never at any point stressed why it needs to be specifically this action that the women have to take, specifically what this motion is about, that you need to take in order for the women to have this act of agency and empowerment that you're putting them across. let's move on. Let's talk about the issue of creating less harm. Because essentially what basically happens here is there are two different lines. The first says, look, this just creates more deterrent, right? And deterrent means that we stop more things happening. This is a huge part of OG's case. And also CG says, look, this happened 1 or 2 times, and then eventually we stop everyone from ever doing it again. Look, as Eitan analyzes to you, right? All of the reasons that OO point out for why this is not likely to deter because the likelihood go down, Eitan then explains to you the missing link in OO's case, which means that the likelihood of getting caught is what is the most thing that is most likely to then affect me in the issue of deterrence. Because look, the marginal difference between sending me to jail and throwing acid in my face, like, that's a big thing. However, it doesn't actually play out that large in my mind when I'm considering what's going to happen 5 years down the line, 10 years down the line. The likelihood of me getting caught and sent to prison or thrown acid in my face is the most important thing. When they haven't been able to engage at all with the fact that this decreases the likelihood of anything, they simply don't know, thank you. They simply aren't stopping more things in the future. But then they say, the other thing they say is, look, it's good because this destroys the system of honor, right? Like, because CG tell us, look, when he throws the acid in his face, this man no longer has honor. This doesn't engage with what Eitan tells you about martyrdom, right? Specifically with the people who are more fundamentalist. Like, a lot of terrorists walk around without arms and legs and everything else. They wear this as a badge of honor, right? Because they have been seen as being imposed, as being crippled in their line of duty, in the holy line of duty that they've caused. So this isn't something that really happens this. And when we and what we say, quite frankly, that when the state comes up there and says, look, retribution is a part of what we want, a part of the system, is a part of Sharia law that we now accept. We now accept as something which is something that we should be used. This means that the fundamentalists, again, the people that Eitan specifically identified, the people who are listening, the people who are on the line of whether or not they might not do this, are then encouraged to create more attacks and more attack and more against women. So you're not really helping out the people. The victims, at the end of the day, have suffered terribly. We don't see why you should create a system which simply makes more people be pushed into a situation of having men throw acid into their faces. We beg you to oppose.